Hello, everyone. Good day and welcome for joining us. Welcome to this Sensations English monthly webinar for teachers. This is our first of our 2023 monthly webinars for teachers. I'm Adam Scott, the ELT specialist at Sensations English, and today I'm going to be speaking about using inclusive global materials in ELT. Please feel free to use the chat to say hello to people across the world, wherever you are. And remember that to please keep the comments focused to the webinar and avoid any spam. The webinar is going to last about an hour and there'll be time for questions at the end. Just to let you know that the webinar is recorded, and if you're watching this webinar live, a CPD will be sent, certificate will be sent to you 24 hours after the webinar has finished. If you're watching the recording, please make your own note of your professional development activity. If you have any questions, please write them in the Q&A box, which appears when you move your mouse to the bottom of the window in Zoom. If someone's already written the question that you want to ask, you can use the thumbs up symbol to push that question up the list instead of writing it again. And if you need any help during the webinar, please just say so in the chat box and I'll be looking out for that. And I'll be asking you to make a few comments in the chat box during the session as well. So just to let you know a little bit about Sensations English, it's focused on helping teachers to develop skills with language learners, and we're delighted to host a regular series of webinars for teachers to support quality evidence-based practice. You can view all of our previous webinars on the Sensations English webinars website, and that includes our monthly webinars and a special series on using video in ELT, and all of these recordings come with the slides from the sessions as well. We hope that they will help you to develop your own practice and expand your use of authentic resources with your classes. In terms of Sensations English resources, it's a great advance in ELT content. We're delighted to offer you hundreds of video and article lessons, all graded at 5 CEFR levels from A2 to C1, and all with ready-made learning activities. They make video and news accessible, as we're going to talk about today, to all learners and hassle-free for teachers in terms of preparation. There are 3 new 5-level resources every week, and that gives you access to the most up-to-date content to use with all of your learners. Our Sensations English Teachers Edition is designed for you to use with your learners, and it gives you logins for all your students, as well as a digital teacher gradebook, which allows you to organise your students into classes, set tasks and monitor them live, and review your learners' progress over time. To start using this, you just need to go to the Sensations English website link on the screens, sensationsenglish.com/teachers, and you can sign up there. So now, to move on, I'm going to start talking now about using inclusive global materials in ELT. So a little overview of what I'm going to say today. First, we're going to focus on what is safe and supportive, because safe and supportive classrooms, safe and supportive teaching, safe and supportive engagement with learners is really key to all of this. It's key to all learning, but then how do we do that when we're bringing in more authentic resources? Then we'll move on to look at lesson content itself, and think about that a little bit before we think about how that relates to connecting with learners. After that, then there's going to be a little focus on thinking about equality and intersectionality, and following that, we'll be dealing with the idea of how to handle complex issues, before returning to the ideas of providing a safe classroom and trying to wrap all of that up in a little summary. So, safe and supportive. I've got a question for you now, so please get your fingers ready for the chat. What is a safe and supportive classroom like? What does it look like? What does it feel like? What does it sound like? So if you've got any ideas, please put them in the chat for a second. Remember, there's no wrong answers. So just give your impressions. Just checking that chat is working. Are we there? Yeah. So for you, in your teaching experience, what is a safe and supportive classroom like? Thinking about maybe in your planning, in your preparation, you anticipate things to try and make the classroom more supportive or more safe, and in the resources you look for, or in the way you're thinking about the students in the class and managing their interaction or their behavior. Got some great ideas here: warm and welcoming classes, strong rapport with students, purposeful feedback, making everyone comfortable so people can free their language. I love that phrase, and I think that's very true. It's that freedom that we're trying to get in language use. Learners supporting each other to feel that the students care about them. Yeah, absolutely. Non-judgmental, supportive, free from a threat environment. That's really important. We'll look at that because that can be quite contentious. Learners not afraid to ask questions yet. Set them classroom rules, smile to each other, trust each other, show empathy, really key. Not afraid to make mistakes, yes. Trust their tutor and one another, feel free to speak out and make mistakes without fear. Yes, all of that. This is brilliant. So I agree with so much of what you've said, and it's such a rich area. And I think it's very important for us to then take a step. You've talked about feeling free, thinking about the key emotions for learners that we're trying to generate in that safe and supportive space, and the key roles for teachers in doing that. And that interaction there is something that we've seen in a lot of what you've been saying in the chat. So we're going to now take a little step on from there to think about, and we're going to come back to that idea of safe and supportive with each little stage of this. So thinking about the lesson content, we've got lesson content which is inclusive, topical, multimodal, and real world. Thinking about that and thinking about, well, the inclusive in many ways relates to the who's being presented, represented, and in what ways are they being represented. In terms of topical lesson content, it's what is being focused on. And if we think about topical, it creates the kind of the focus on an event or an issue which is engaging to learners. In terms of the inclusive, we're showing a wide variety of different identities. Some of the more traditional resources have been accused of being a bit magazine-y, that, you know, it's all just like seeing the same kind of people in the content again and again, and not creating that kind of richness and variety of people and identities within that. When we think about multimodal, video is a great multimodal resource. So how is that language being presented? You've got image, moving image, you've got interview in the resources we make, you've got interview clips from people, so you've got different voices, different ideas. You've also got subtitles and a transcript that students can use as well, and that content is controllable by, if you give the learners the content to access, for example, on their own device, then you can allow the students to control how they engage with it, how they watch or listen or read, and that then is giving a wider variety of access to the information within the language, in the report, in the news, in the video. And in terms of real world, it locates the information, it locates the topic, it locates the people within a space, within a place, and therefore gives it an identity which is much more meaningful to students and allows them to either relate to it directly or in a transferred way, through a degree of separation and relationship to their own understandings and their own existence. And when we think about those things, then if you look at the panel on the right, in terms of inclusive, we're thinking about safe and supportive, we're thinking about positive representations of people, ensuring that we are showing respect to these different identities, and that will bleed through to the classroom as well, and to the way in which the students in the class are responding and reflecting on those people. In terms of topical, it's creating a meaningful focus for the learners. It's something relevant to life now, it's something relevant to their existence, the world outside of the classroom, and it's then making that language use that comes from that much more memorable, much more something that the students are engaged with. And we'll talk about that, the impacts of that, a little bit later. In terms of multimodal, it's an interesting way of creating more stimulating engagement, because learners are able to interact with the information in through various different modes, but also they're able to interact with the information, if they've got it in their hand, in the way that they choose. And so with video, you can pause and rewind or skip forwards, and students can then control how they are absorbing or uptaking that information, or receiving that input, sorry. And then in terms of real world, you're creating context-based learning, which is focusing on language use in context, and therefore you don't get such a narrow focus on a particular lexical set or a particular grammatical form. It's presented much more in a tapestry of language, which then creates more understanding of the interrelationship between different elements of vocabulary and grammar as well, which is something that we won't always be pulling out and saying, look at, identify the connection between these two structures, for example, but it will be an awareness that's being built by the learner as well. And that kind of association is something that's going to enrich their language development too. So, oh, we've got a duplicate of this slide. Sorry, I thought, why isn't it animating? Okay, so then if we think about the development that I've just started talking about, the language and skills development and the learning content and how they interact, then we get this idea that the more topical and meaningful the content is, in the ways that we can make it, as I've just outlined, then the more that we can enhance learners' uptake of language that we've chosen for input, and also their output of language as they use language that's related to the topic and the content that we've exposed the learners to. And we did some teacher trials using Sensations English content, and the feedback was that there was an astounding kind of level of engagement and level of language appropriation and use from the lesson content. And this was one quote: students were engaged with the material and managed to use the language well in follow-up activities. And the teacher in this case was surprised by how much the students were taking up. From my experience teaching beginners, I know that beginner learners, when you put them close enough that they can hear each other, they're very quick to steal a word that they hear from, or borrow a word that they hear from someone else and use it themselves, because it's very much the words that they're looking for at that moment, but maybe don't have, but understand enough from the context in which they're using it to take it from the other student and use it in their own group, small groups conversation. And so that kind of understanding, or that kind of dynamic, is, I think, something where you've got meaningful content in a text that learners are just able to grab and then use to express themselves in that content as well, in that discussion as well. Then I think that's really what's happening here, that the resources themselves are so coming so close to the learner that their engagement, their focus is allowing them to then take that language and use it for themselves. and make it theirs. And so building on their idea of voice and the ideas that we were talking about in a safe classroom of giving students the opportunity to speak. So here's an example of one resource that I'd like us to just think about the different ways in which going back to the inclusive, topical, and real world, the positive representations, the meaningfulness, how and the context-based nature of it. If we go forwards now and watch this, and watch this, then we'll just have a look at how we manage to kind of, or the different influences that we can put in place here.
Zwelithini had the longest reign of any monarch in Zulu history, serving his people for over half a century. The Zulu king's role is purely ceremonial with no executive power, but many of the country's 11 million Zulus followed Zwelithini's guidance on cultural matters. The monarch's reign was dedicated to restoring Zulu traditions, a move criticised by some but welcomed by others.
It is important to me because that is where I found my identity as a Zulu woman. This is where I've learned about my culture. It's where I also tackled my own personal issues about such as body image issues, low self-esteem. This is where I conquered all that, because when you hear nobody cares about your body size, your body shape.
So if we think about that in terms of the who is being represented, what is being represented, and where is being represented, we've got sorry, is the chat working? Yeah. We've got a society, people in a society in Southern Africa. We've got a cultural identity of the Zulu people. We've got a woman talking about her own identity within that culture and various topical issues. We've got an event, which is the death of someone. Everyone last year was very interested in the moment when Queen Elizabeth passed away and the transition there. So there's a relationship there between different monarchs and their status and the way in which countries or people respond to that and those kinds of events. And also then we've got the idea of the context here, which is the context, and then we've got the idea of that context not just being a national event but relating to different people and individuals, and the way in which that kind of then sets the stage for students to be able to talk about and pick up language from that and to be able to talk about their own identities and their own situation too.
Zwelithini.
So, and that's what I'm really thinking about when I'm moving on to the idea of connecting with learners. And there are two things that we can think about here: connecting with learners' lived experience and also connecting with the wider world. Part of our job is to relate the learner's own classroom experience to the wider world outside and the ways in which they're going to be able to use language that we're introducing them to within their own lives, and connecting that to both their own lived experience and the world they're interacting with. So I'm repeating myself there. News-based content is really useful for this because it has this person-centered focus. And that allows students to think about their own lives and also other people that they interact with. And it gives examples of universals. It's event-based content, but each event is an example of a kind of a universal. We might talk about archetypes in more kind of like literary writing. And so through those universals, we can then connect in with our life experience as learners ourselves, and our learners can do that. And so you're bridging that gap between the wider world and lived experience as students find equivalents in their own worlds about the situation that they've seen. For example, in that last example, either about an event such as a leader's death, or we've got that relationship to death itself. And also we've got the idea of our identity within a culture as well, and what things mean to us when they happen in a national context. And then that all encourages the developing of schema, because you're linking any new language that you're introducing onto existing schemata, existing networks of language understanding and connections, which are in the learner's own mind, so and already built. So it opens a lot of nodes, if you like, for new language to be attached to existing understanding and existing knowledge, scaffolding that uptake process. I always show this slide in virtually every talk I ever do now, I think, but it's really a crucial one for expressing anything about the idea of critical thinking and news-based content. When we think about Bloom's taxonomy, which we all know about remembering, understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating and creating as the different layers of the taxonomy and the different thinking skills, we know that lower order thinking content is quite common in course books, and higher order thinking skills and content is more of a challenge and more something we have to kind of work harder as teachers to promote. And that's partly due to the ways in which the resources ask students to do things. So you've got verbs such as memorize, explain, and use in the lower order thinking skills, recalling specific facts and information, explaining ideas, using information in a new situation when we go into a role play activity or something. But then the more critical skills, the more higher order skills, such as comparing, which, you know, we use in a lot of exam activities, examining, questioning, drawing connections among ideas, and then moving up to appraising, critiquing, judging and selecting information and supporting your ideas with information, examining information and making judgments. And then at the highest level, designing, developing, formulating, investigating, using information to create something new. Those are the thinking skills which we automatically promote when we are looking at within ourselves, when we're looking at news-based content, because we're constantly trying to relate that to the effects on us or the effects on people like us if it's not affecting us, the empathizing, imagining that situation. If it were me, if it were someone I know, it is someone I know. All of those kinds of associations which scaffold and spark higher order thinking. And they're really crucial to meaningful language development. And they're also very much embedded in news-based content. So thinking about the idea of the impact of inclusive global content, it raises interest in our learners, it promotes critical thinking, and thereby it increases language uptake and output through its relatability and its relevance to our learners. So I'm going to ask you to, it's not a pair discussion, sorry. I'm going to ask you to think about these ideas about ways in which a teacher could scaffold language and skills development around the next report that I show you, and how learners might relate this to their own concerns and lived experience. So think about those two questions. How, as a teacher, how could you scaffold language and skills development? And as a learner, how might a learner relate this situation to their own concerns or lived experience? So this report is only a short segment of a report that is about disabled people's experience in Shanghai in China. So have a look at that and think about those two questions. And then afterwards, we'll look at those questions and put any answers you have in the chat, any ideas.
Xiao Hong Cheng blogs about disabled people's rights and campaigns for equality. Zhao has relied on a wheelchair since contracting polio during childhood. Although educated to master's level herself, Zhao argues that many people with disabilities are denied educational opportunities.
Wheelchair users still face difficulties getting into education and employment. That's why they are not being seen very often. But that doesn't mean there are not many of them. The number of wheelchair users is actually very high.
Okay, so thinking about that and these two questions, any ideas that you have, please put them in the chat. So is it Melanie is saying teachers that can have discussions with students about disabilities? Yeah. And another thing is we need to remember that the lives of students are not isolated, that they may have people in their families or their friendship groups with disabilities. And so seeing those people reflected in their learning resources, in their learning environment is going to impact in a positive way their experience, and it's going to give them something to talk about which they are motivated to talk about. Students can give examples from their own lives, and they might be transferred examples. They might not be about that particular topic, but they might be of a related topic. I teach in a college, so I would ask students to talk about the facilities in the college for disabled students. Samaha, yes, absolutely. That's bringing it back into their context as well. And you'll find that students maybe even start doing that without you even asking them to. That's the nature of the way in which critical thinking is kind of scaffolded into these things, that students are already thinking about those issues. As soon as you see the lift and in the building, for example, thinking, how do people get through the barrier in our building? What other challenges are there? And Natasha says that students say that we are all different, and students can come up with different ideas about how to facilitate different disabled people's lives. And then also other people's lives. Other people who campaign for rights, for example, or other people who are vloggers and presenting different views of the world. And so there's so many different ways in which you can take that, which are stimulating and bringing the issues out. And then you've talked about the teacher's ideas, but how might learners relate this experience to their own lived experience? So I suppose we can relate it. They can think about their own environment. They can think about their own people, friends, and they can also think about how, if someone's campaigning for rights, for example, that means that maybe they're not living as freely and fully as the rest of us can, and therefore that might be something that they relate to in another way. Students might then jump towards taking a focus on the environment and how issues around the environment are damaging all of our lives, and there's a need for us to campaign on that basis. Or, for example, access to education, which was raised in the idea of how people aren't included in society because of their disability in that piece, for example. Okay, so I'm just going to move on now a little bit and think about the idea of focusing on language skills. So we've been thinking about is a way of bringing together all of learners' abilities with language knowledge and skills. And so in terms of using this resource in the classroom as a teacher focusing on language skills, we can think about how to develop learners' independence with that and scaffold their progression. We're going to talk a little bit later about level appropriacy, but with a resource which has 5 different levels, such as Sensations English, students can move from one level to another, depending on the challenge of the speed of delivery, the way in which words link together or are more clearly separated at different levels, and also developing independence in terms of their control over the actual audio. They can, as I said before, pause, rewind, skip forwards, and decide how to interact with that and how to then focus on particular areas of listening skills. In terms of reading, if they're doing some using a transcript, helping to scaffold sub-skills within reading and both with reading and listening, improving the closer understanding of the meaning of things through comprehension questions and other activities that deal with that. And there are comprehension questions with all the resources we make. In terms of speaking then and writing, moving on to that, thinking about how we scaffold language use within speaking and writing. So we talked already about the peer discussions that students will be having, able to have, and I can see May is talking about putting students in groups and asking them to create something. That's absolutely brilliant. And then in terms of developing a personal voice as well, every time that a student's talking about something that they're interested in, that they're engaged with, that they have a view on, they're practicing manipulating their ideas through tone and style as much as through the actual speaking action mechanically itself. And so we're thinking about the ways in which we're expanding the range of activities that students can do in the classroom through that engagement and making those activities more engaging as a result. And then in terms of writing, exploring syntax and style, exploring that voice some more, and bringing up new vocabulary as well, and thinking about things as basic as the kind of scripting, the spelling and pronunciation of words, and then how to combine them together into your argument. So there's a great space for creative language use through writing as well. And all of that is building confidence using language which emerges out of the content. And so it's a kind of a way of generating emergent language from the context in which it's being placed. Santiana, yeah, feel free to write if you have a problem or anything like that. So looking on and thinking about how that then, we're thinking about the safe and supportive classroom space. And a key element of that is equality and intersectional perspectives. So there we saw in that last example, someone who was a vlogger, a wheelchair user, a graduate of university, a rights campaigner, and they had all these different identities, a city dweller, they had all these different identities, and they were all part of that one person. And all of those different identities were in some way coming through in the report, in the content. And that's very important, that idea of all these different elements, because a student or anyone reading or listening or watching that report would be connecting with different elements of it, which are more or less meaningful to them, but also seeing how they relate to each other. And that intersectional focus, like an intersection of a motorway, is where lots of people come through with all these different issues and see how they connect to each other. And it's a way of presenting richly contextualized people and places and those positive representations of lives and real world issues, and bringing them connections in connection with learners' experiences, ideas, and concerns. So we're going to watch another little video now, and I'd like you to think about what elements intersect in this video. And this is just to prove that you can do things at the lowest level. This is really for elementary level. So this is a complex topic dealing with various different elements, which is being able to be brought up and then hopefully discussed by learners at an elementary level. So have a look at this.
Yogetu Agasaka is from Japan. He is a Buddhist monk. He usually helps families when someone dies. The lockdown stopped his work. So he made new Buddhist music during lockdown. Akasaka likes beatboxing. He makes music with his mouth. Now he is mixing beatboxing with Buddhist songs. Lots of people listen to his music on YouTube. He is happy about this.
I just realized that I can just spread my stuff not only in Japan but to like in the world.
Akasaka wasn't always a Buddhist monk. He started when he was 30 years old. He hopes young people will listen to his music. He hopes they become interested in Buddhism.
So maybe if my music attracts younger people, it'll be a good opportunity for them to know about like the Buddhism.
So if we think about what elements intersect in this video, if you've got any ideas, please pop them in the chat. So we've got some ideas here such as religion, social media, music, and bringing religion and music together, religion, faith, expression through music, absolutely. Culture, wider culture and religion, impact of lockdown, yes. And, you know, he helps families when someone dies. So it's about, you know, there's another element of death there, but not being brought through in a confrontational way, in a triggering way for learners, but as part of a richer tapestry of life. And so there's various different ways in which we've got people's identities, people's choices, because that man was not always a Buddhist. He a Buddhist monk. He came to that decision and that awareness later in life. We've got the ways in which the language he uses can be then taken by us and used to express different information on different topics, but using the same language, taking those ideas of sharing ideas with each other and thinking about different ways in which that can be done as well. There's lots of different elements of interest, passion, identity, life experience, life stages, media, that all come together in a report like that. So we're just going to think about that and move on. I'm conscious of the time that we are at here. So thinking about equality and intersectionality, you've got enriched content that is really bringing up a lot of different people, different perspectives, different angles on life, and showing people in a positive way. And that is then bringing an enriched learning experience to students, because they may not be interested in the language that you're focusing on, but they may be very interested in the message which is within that language. And it encourages learners to make these links between how they, both between the experience and the content of the information, and also the language use that's being, the language which is being used within that to express that information. And so therefore it's helping to link with learners' existing knowledge about language and their usage of language as well. And coming up to something that someone was talking about in the chat, that relates to all skills, not just the productive skills, but also in terms of listening and reading, as well as speaking and writing. And so maybe there'll be some questions that we can discuss in the chat at the end, in the Q&A at the end of this. Just thinking about Sensations English in terms of this idea of this intersectionality. We were a finalist in the British Council ELTs in 2021 for learner resources, and we're also the winner of one of the commendations for equality, diversity and inclusion. And that really relates to how the issues that within that of gender, race, ethnicity and culture, age, disability, religion or belief and sexual identity, as well as broader categories such as socioeconomic background, urban and rural realities, and linguistic diversity, all intermingle in these resources and make them very impactful as learner resources. And it's that kind of level of representation that is very difficult to achieve in certain other contexts, which news actually supports, because you're representing people and you're showing their lives and you're focusing on them through a particular event, and that is helping to combine those elements in a way that a focus on, for example, disability or a focus on religion would put the idea at the center, and therefore the people have to fit around that, if you like, or different angles of those people's identities get pushed to the background. So that's something to think about in terms of how engaging news, again, how engaging news can bring all of these elements together. And just to say that at the ELTs in 2021, we also were the only winner of the inaugural commendation for environmental sustainability and climate action. And that's another way in which socioeconomic background, urban and rural realities and linguistic diversity really mix in with the ideas of environmental rights or the climate crisis as well, and the ways in which those elements are not siloed into the topic of environment on its own. They interact with all the other elements of our lives as well, and they are those complex issues. And so in terms of thinking again about the safe and supportive classroom and how we handle complex issues within that, part of it is to develop learners' voices. And in the classroom environment, we've got this conflict because we've got issue-based content, and the classroom environment is somewhere we want to be safe and supportive. And yet the issue-based content has challenges for that in terms of how people might feel about those issues, whether they are sympathetic to them or whether they have some kind of problem with them, or whether they don't feel that they're appropriate for the classroom and could cause conflict within the classroom. And therefore, teachers often avoid those challenges in order to keep the environment in the classroom safe, which limits or reduces the engagement within the classroom, because you're taking away those exact topics which might be more engaging. And so thinking about how to provide safe opportunities there, there's various aspects which we've talked about a little bit in this session, and I just want to kind of like then go through a little bit more. We've got to think about the level of challenge. Someone was talking about the level of challenge of listening. If you're challenging your learners with content which is too high, that's going to overload them cognitively. It's going to therefore reduce the brain space, the energy that you've got left for engaging with the content. So at a linguistic level, the level must be appropriate for the students. And most resources that are authentic are written for a first language audience, whereas Sensations English takes that content and grades it for 5 different levels. So there's always an appropriate level of challenge to get the same content. Also think about the level of the learner's experience. If you bring in something which is totally alien to the learners, totally beyond their experience. For example, if you're working with a younger group of students and you bring in something about a more technical adult topic, it's not going to be appropriate to their level of experience. So it's about selecting the resources which are of relevance to the learner's experience as well. We've seen how news widens that massively because there's many intersectional kind of and related angles that students can see to a piece of, to an event-based focus, which brings a context and a meaningful setting to a piece of language study. Excuse me. And so that, again, makes it more accessible to learners, a wider range of resources or contexts more accessible to learners. And then we've got these person-centered contexts, which not only help to engage, but help to encourage respect for the people within it, because they're being presented as people just as you or I or them, or the students, within a event-based context. So we're seeing those different elements, those different aspects of a person's lived reality, their identity happening, whether they're walking down the street, talking to family, at work, whatever those elements are, they're also what we do. And therefore, those person-centered contexts make more of the take away more of the risk of challenges which are against someone's identity within a classroom context. And then, of course, there's the inclusive language. Now, some news, as we all know, is quite divisive, quite polarizing, and that's the opposite of what we're trying to bring into the classroom. And at Sensations English, we work really hard to ensure that our content uses inclusive language, is respectful of all people who we portray in reports, in the news that we provide. And that's a real key element, because by modeling that inclusive language, you're then encouraging learners to use that inclusive language or that inclusive perspective within their own language uptake and use output. So that's really crucial as well. And then, of course, if we're using motivating, inclusive, issue-based content, then we're encouraging learners to engage with that content and consider it, and therefore build on that foundation. So you're actually providing a really stable, safe foundation, complex but safe foundation for learners to then develop through. And then finally, thinking about reflective learning. All of these elements are helping to scaffold the idea that students are thinking about themselves, the event that you're seeing, the people that you're seeing, the issues that represents, and the elements of identity and culture and work or lived experience, which that includes, and seeing how they analyze that, compare that, and create something new from their own understanding of that. And that's where the voice suddenly has a lot to say, and that focus then is not on polemic or divisive issues, but it's actually on getting your ideas out and seeing where those ideas match or differ from other people's, and then kind of seeing how much further you can go in expressing your own thoughts about your own identities and your own experiences and your own, how this is relevant to you within the language that you've been scaffolded to take up and use because of the context within which this is this event has been focused. So there's a lot going on there, which is then helping teachers to provide students with safe opportunities, which then, you know, as you can see the picture on the right, which has got such a diversity of different identities within it, make any of those which seemed very distant and less relatable to an individual in a classroom more a step closer towards them instead, and something which has some commonality with their own experience too. So then just wrapping up, thinking about providing safe classrooms, we're thinking about being inclusive, valuing learners and reflecting diversity. So we're thinking about the spaces and the learning resources, and also the support we're giving learners, and the support actually that teachers need to be given as well. So don't be afraid to go and get that support either from other teachers within your staff room, within your environment, or from a request for training or direction from your managers as well. And valuing learners' lives and their voices, seeing what they've got to say in a respectful way within the classroom environment, sharing their perspectives and their ideas. And then reflecting diversity, we talked about how there's different people within a classroom, you know, they've got different things going on, they've got different backgrounds, and they've also got different families who are connected to them, different people within their lives who would be reflected in the class, in the resources, and also helping to bring that wider world outside the classroom into the classroom, so that then learners feel more related to it and more able to speak about it. So just in summary, enhancing uptake and output is really our goal as language teachers, but doing that through meaningful and topical learning content. And that helps to connect with learners and drive that language and skills development. And you're building and developing learners' voices by using person-centered contexts, which again are helping to make that a much safer opportunity. And you are, through the use of this inclusive content, constructing these safe opportunities and managing your classrooms through that inclusion. So that's everything from me. We've now got a little bit of time for some questions if anyone has any. I can see that a couple of people are asking about feedback and the PowerPoint. So the Sensations English Webinars.co.uk website has got all of that information on it. You can go to that, and that will be updated either later today or early tomorrow, and the certificates, if anyone's asking about those, will be sent via email 24 hours after the webinar has finished, so you'll get that in your inbox tomorrow. I can see there's a couple of questions in the Q&A box. All about the certificates. Yes, the certificates will be sent via email tomorrow. You'll receive them 24 hours after this webinar has finished. Okay. Has anyone got any other questions that they wanted to ask? There was one question that I think Mesma had about listening, teaching listening, and your students struggle with listening. So that's about phonological processing of speech sound in some senses, and that challenge of dealing with the stream of speech and how quickly it moves, and how the interplay of that with vocabulary knowledge and grammatical knowledge is a challenge. When students are reading, they have time, they're in control in a sense of time. When students are writing, they're also in control in a sense of time. With listening, the time is out of the student's control. So there's various things you can do in terms of giving the students control. Something like Sensations English, where you've got a resource which the students can use on their phone, and they can pause and rewind, and they can fast forward and focus on different elements of an audio track or a video with audio in it. That's good to give students more control over that. But then the thing is that you need to reinsert the time element. So you need to give students a time limit within which they can do this, so that they realize there are choices to be made, because you're never going to understand everything that you hear in your own language. Your brain kind of fudges it so you think you do, but you're never going to actually process the stream of speech completely in your own language. Cognitive capacity, processing capacity isn't that big. So it's about helping students to make choices about what they can cope with understanding, or can cope with not understanding, in terms of a percentage of what they hear, and the way in which the verbal cues that they do pick up and do process contribute to their level of understanding. There's also the idea that if you're asking learners to process something which is too challenging for them, then that's going to be demotivating. And the idea of scaffolding that and helping learners to actually realize where they are in terms of their linguistic abilities, in terms of listening skills. And so something like the Sensations English resources, where you've got 5 different levels of the same information with more simple vocabulary and grammar as you go down the levels, but also with slower speech and more segmented words, more clear word boundaries. That means that students can decide what level of listening skill they actually have at the moment, and then work from that foundation upwards in terms of the challenges that they face with listening, and the practice they need to do, and the awareness they need to build in order to improve their listening. And I say awareness they need to build, both they need to become more fluent at processing speech sound, but they also need to become more confident at not understanding everything, and that being okay. And the idea of, I talk to my students about listening forwards. Don't ruminate, don't worry about what you haven't heard, and think about what that is, because in the meantime, the listening is still continuing and you're missing the next pieces. And we know that for students who say that people speak very fast, actually, if they're pausing and trying to focus on something they've just heard, then and slow that down, that actually has the effect of, in the student's mind, seeming that their speed, what's coming next is speeded up instead, because you've kind of stretched or compressed time, and therefore that's something that's not totally objective. It's very much within the actions and the focus of the learners when they're listening. So getting some of this out into the classroom slowly for them, just bit by bit, as you build those listening skills and sub-skills, that's really crucial in helping students to take ownership of their listening, just like they would their writing or their speaking. I hope that's useful for you. Another question from, I always try to include inclusive tasks. However, when it is time for the students to work on speaking or writing, they are hesitant to participate due to their poor vocabulary. Any idea how to tackle this? Well, I think you need an inclusive resource which they can use to take vocabulary from and to take language from. And that's why this kind of skills focused input, this input which is based around a text, which has got the content that you want in it, which has got that engagement built into it, is something that's very helpful. It's allowing learners to have something there, a pool of language that they can take and use to help them express themselves. So thinking about how, if you use tasks, if you use texts or resources already as you're doing that, thinking about how the questions that you ask to help guide the students step by step towards more critical language use and critical tasks, then think about how you're scaffolding the students' ability to pick up and take and use that language that's embedded in the resource that you're basing that on, in order to give them the language that they use. Normally, what happens when students are quiet is that something's been jumped during the staging of the lesson. So there's been a jump too far, and learners have lost their confidence and feel they haven't been suitably supported, and therefore don't really know what to do. And so any element, any stage that you do in your lesson, try and pick it apart and think what cognitive skills, what learner attributes, what content are learners going to need to complete this. And if there's more than maybe 2 elements to it, you need to think about how to break that task down into 2 or more manageable tasks, which help to get the student to that end goal. So no jumping, but really step by step, helping learners to achieve that. And by doing that, you can even get beginner level learners to have massively confident and fantastic output within the confines of the language that they've got to work with, because they've had that scaffolding, they've been supported all the way through, and they feel confident. I hope that's useful for you, Samaha. Okay, I think that's everything from everyone. Yeah, and the recording, I can just see some people asking about the recording. The recording will be on the website tomorrow as well, and you'll receive an email that gives you a link to the recording along with your certificate. The other thing to say is just to remember to have a look at the teacher's edition to see if that's interesting for you, and also then to make sure that you're taking advantage of the information that Sensations English sends out on social media, and the latest resources at sensationsenglish.com. Thanks ever so much. This has been our first webinar of 2023. We look forward to seeing you again in February for our next webinar, and please remember to check out our graded, authentic global resources. Thanks very much. Have a great day wherever you are. Good morning, good evening, good night, and see you again soon. Take care. Bye.